In many ways, the male libido is the fulcrum of civilization. The fact that men wish to copulate with women stands, at the end of the day, at the centerpiece of why men are motivated, at least in the large majority, that's not universal, but in the large majority, to do things, to get things done, to achieve things, to bring about quote-unquote greatness, right? Now, as I said, honorable mentions to people such as Isaac Newton or Nikola Tesla, these are exceptions, but broadly speaking, men are motivated by reproductive drive. And male libido is an essential part of that. But like many things in the world, male libido is a double-edged sword. Now, you might have heard the turn of phrase frequently, especially coming from women, that men ought to just keep it in their pants, right? Or they can't keep it in their pants. Now, when women say this, they're not entirely wrong, but they don't have the right interpretation of what's going on here. There are indeed many men who struggle to, quote-unquote, keep it in their pants. In fact, recently we have an infamous streamer who is making this very particular point for us, who has had a long history of not being able to keep it in his pants. In fact, he has been repeatedly driven by his libido to do very unsavory things, and it basically never nets him a positive. It always nets him a negative. Now, this guy is successful, and he has made a lot of money, but most recently, for example, because he could not, quote-unquote, keep it in his pants, he is dealing with a lawsuit that could maybe not bankrupt him, but certainly severely damage him in terms of his assets, and has done a lot of reputational damage. Whether or not he recovers from this or not is an entirely different question, but it just goes to show that a man who cannot control his libidinous instincts, a man who is so driven by his libido that every time opportunity presents itself, he has to whip out his schlong and make use of it, well, that's the opposite of the productive power that comes from the instinct to procreate, the instinct to pursue females. And indeed, that is the other very sharp edge of the sword. And of course, you have to be in the situation to begin with to have the opportunity, goes without saying, to be driven by your instincts to engage in such behaviors in the first place. That's kind of obvious. I've never been especially successful with women, but back in the day, in my youth, I've had a number of relationships, obviously, and I managed to successfully steer away from temptation on more than one occasion, despite the screaming voices in the back of my head, screaming to my then youthful and libidinous self that I need to stick it in and do the deed. Everything was telling me to do this. I realized that in many of these instances, in fact, I can think of one or two where it would have been absolute disaster, no question, I held back, ultimately. I had to hold back, and you can only imagine how it is for really, really successful men, chads, men who get a lot of access to punani, and despite their prowess, despite their reputation, despite their ability to get access to it in the first place, they're always just a boink away from potential disaster. Of course, it's nice to have the reputation, the looks, the combination, all the above, to have access on a regular basis to that sort of thing. But even the most successful man, even the most famous man, even the wealthiest man, needs to, at least a certain degree, take into account the fact that a runaway libido can have disastrous and destructive consequences. And like I said, I cited the streamer before, but it can happen to a normal guy too. For example, I used to have this friend 20 years ago or so, pretty good friends. He was in this long-term relationship with this woman, 5, 6 years, something along those lines. And you could say he was growing bored, but that's pretty normal. Relationships, the highs, the honeymoon phase, it really lasts. It was pretty stable, and she seemed more or less okay-ish. I didn't really know her well, but she seemed okay-ish, right? But this friend of mine, who was pretty good looking overall, certainly better looking than I was, and certainly taller, had an opportunity presented to him by some woman that was flirting with him, and one thing led to another, and they ended up boinking on several occasions. Now, he was still in this relationship. Now, my impression of the woman that he was together with was always that, like I said, she was normal, pretty stable, nothing wrong with her. But that turn of phrase, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, that is not just made up for the sake of making things up. Shakespeare did not pull that out of his buttocks. He knew what was up. And it seemed like overnight when she found out about it, and I don't know how she found out about it, maybe she had spies, this woman turned from what appeared to be initially a normal, relatively stable individual into an absolute lunatic, in part, I think, because this other woman that the guy cheated with, she was noticeably better looking. That probably was a big incentivizing factor here. But she turned absolutely gaga and turned his life into a living hell. She basically would verbally abuse him all the time, despite him trying to make amends, despite him trying to do this and that. She would follow him everywhere, effectively stalk him, even though they were still together technically. She would check his emails and text messages on his phone. It was incessant. And anytime he wanted to go out, even if it was with me, she would accuse him of trying to boink some new girl or what have you. Now, like I said, there are probably a lot of reasons for this. Again, the woman that he cheated on her with was noticeably better looking, and she probably had a lot of insecurities at the end of the day. She was kind of homely, not bad looking, but very homely looking, if I remember correctly. And it just turned her into something absolutely intolerable. Now, a number of things happen, and eventually he has to split up with her because she's not letting go, and she decided to turn his life into a living hell, even if he was remorseful and regretful. And oh boy, that's when the stuff really started, because he was a free agent, and once he was a free agent, i.e. no longer together with her, of course he went back to taking advantage of various opportunities, including the woman that he had boinked with, i.e. the woman that he had cheated on her with, and she found out about that. Apparently she had been following him or something, and by the God, she lost it. Eventually, after several weeks, all this culminated in her trying to smash his door down. He opens up the door, and she attacks him with a knife. Now, obviously, he's much bigger and stronger than her, but a knife is no silly business here. Whether you're big or strong or not, a knife in the gut can kill you very quickly. So he got very lucky because she missed several times with some swipes. But it's an extreme example, admittedly. But it just goes to show that if your libido is not in check, it is probably not a good thing. Now, in the case of this individual woman, maybe if he had broken up with her initially, it might not have been as bad. It's impossible to tell whether it would have been as bad as it turned out to be, and it is an extreme example. But the point remains that if you're a male with a lot of opportunity, you really need to pick and choose your battles. I totally get the idea of blowing your load, but there's some instances where it's just better to use the old left or right hand just to knock it out so you can enjoy the feeling and the important superpower, if you wish to call it that, of post-com clarity. When you do not have post-com clarity, you are not thinking straight, especially when you're young. When you're below 40, your libido will lead you to many a potential disaster long term, and you really need to keep that in check. Now, I'm obviously sympathetic to the idea, because it's true, that most men obviously don't have these many opportunities. I certainly didn't. I had a few. But here's the thing. Even if you're a nobody, even if you're not good looking or tall or have money or famous or what have you, there's an argument to be made that controlling your libido is even more important. And why? Because if you are attractive and tall, in the case of this former friend of mine, he was pretty tall, about 6 feet tall, pretty good looking overall, relatively athletic, you are benefiting from the halo effect. So even when you engage in such activities, even if you're committing quote-unquote wrongdoing, engaging in cheating or extra pair copulation, if you wish to frame it that way, you are still going to receive the benefit of the doubt because of your looks, because of your presentation. Now imagine being average looking, average height, below average looking, below average height, and you engage in some sort of libidinous activity that presents itself, and the woman regrets it or something, or she is intoxicated, or even worse, and I saw this happen one time to a guy that was not especially good looking, she accuses the dude of carnal violation because A, she was a bit tipsy, intoxicated, and B, she wasn't thinking straight, and she ended up copulating with a guy that probably wasn't particularly attractive, and she really, really regretted it. And in order to sort of justify it to her social circles, I saw this happen, she ended up accusing the guy of carnal violation. And that is why even in the case of not having lots of opportunities, it's probably even more important to quote-unquote keep it in your pants, to control your libidinous desires, because male libido can be used, siphoned for positive, productive ends, but when it's left to run rampant, you can see the destructive outcomes, at least potentially. It doesn't always end up that way, but why take the chance? And I think this is an important topic to talk about every now and then, because we forget very easily. It's easy for me to forget because I'm pushing 50 and my libido basically doesn't exist anymore, more or less, through a combination of age and chronic sleep deprivation. If you're young, it's a totally different story. And even if you're not young, the amount of old geezers you see, relatively speaking, that engage in potentially ruinous extracurricular activities, so to speak, is fairly alarming. So you don't want to be that guy. I'm telling you, it's important to bear this in mind, because whether you're really good looking or average or bad looking, being able to control your libidinous instincts, your reproductive drive, can end up saving your buttocks in the future in manifold ways, in terms of financial loss, in terms of accusations, in terms of dealing with psychotic women, you name it. If you're ever tempted but have these niggling doubts in the back of your mind because you think there might be something off about the situation, listen to those doubts. Don't ignore them. You're probably right about being hesitant. Don't plug it in. It's just not worth it. Pick and choose your copulatory battles, gentlemen. That is an important lesson, whether you're wealthy, good-looking, or the polar opposite. It holds true every time. But in any event, as always, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my very generous patrons on Patreon, my donors on PayPal. You guys are the best. Without you, this channel could not exist. And if you can hit the bell icon to be informed of my videos, it'd be much appreciated. And engage in the usual YouTube jazz of liking the video, subscribing, leaving a comment, sharing it with some people maybe, be appreciated. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out then. Until the next time, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye for now.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.